For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered as fearless warriors, daring explorers, and legendary conquerors. But their story is more than just raids and battles. It is a saga of ambition, survival, and the relentless pursuit of glory. From the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the mighty kingdoms of England, these seafarers carved their names into history with their swords and their courage. But how did a people from the harshest lands rise to challenge the great rulers of the world? And what was the price of their conquests? This is the story of the Northmen. The icy winds howled across the rugged shores of Scandinavia, where towering fjords met the endless sea. In this land of long winters and fleeting summers, a people of great strength and ambition thrived: the Vikings. These seafaring warriors were more than just raiders. They were explorers, traders, and settlers who would leave an unforgettable mark on history. Among them was a young warrior named Erik Thorvaldsson, known simply as Erik the Bold. Born under the glow of the northern lights, he was raised on stories of adventure and glory. His father, a seasoned sailor, spoke of lands across the horizon, great kingdoms of wealth and power, waiting to be claimed. As Erik grew, so did his hunger for adventure. He trained in combat, mastered the art of sailing, and learned the wisdom of the Skalds, the storytellers who preserved Viking legends. One fateful evening, as Erik stood by the fire listening to the elders, a messenger arrived from the shores of Denmark. He spoke of a great gathering. Chieftains from all corners of the north had been called to a thing, a council where warriors would decide the fate of their people. Whispers of distant lands reached Erik's ears. Rich cities across the sea, golden treasures guarded by unprepared rulers, and fertile lands ripe for settlement. With his father's blessing, Erik gathered a crew of fearless men and prepared his longship, the Stormfang. The vessel was a marvel of Viking craftsmanship, sleek, fast, and adorned with a carved dragon's head to strike fear into the hearts of those who saw it. As the sun rose, casting golden light upon the restless waves, Erik and his warriors set sail. Their destination? The legendary shores of England. Little did they know their arrival would change the course of history forever. The North Sea was restless, its waves crashing against the hull of the Stormfang as Erik and his warriors sailed toward the horizon. The salty wind carried the scent of distant lands, and with each passing day the promise of adventure burned brighter in their hearts. After weeks at sea, a shadow emerged on the horizon. England, a land of rolling green fields, mighty stone fortresses, and wealthy monasteries filled with treasures. But the Northmen were not the first to see these shores. English scouts had already spotted their sails, and word of their arrival spread quickly through the coastal villages. Erik and his men landed near a small monastery, its bell ringing in warning. The monks hurried to hide their sacred texts and gold, but the Northmen moved swiftly. With axes gleaming and shields locked, they marched forward. Yet, unlike in the stories of easy victories, this time the defenders stood their ground. Local warriors, alerted by the monastery's bell, arrived with spears and swords in hand. A fierce battle erupted. The clash of steel echoed across the land as Viking shields met English blades. Erik fought with the skill of a seasoned warrior, his axe carving through the enemy lines. But the English had the advantage of numbers and knowledge of the terrain. For every man the Vikings felled, another seemed to take his place. Realizing the tide of battle could turn against them, Erik raised his sword and called for a retreat. They withdrew to the shore, taking what little treasure they had claimed. As they pushed their longships back into the sea, Erik looked at the burning monastery behind him. This was no mere raid. It was the beginning of something far greater. From that day forward, the Northmen knew that England would not fall easily, but neither would they give up. Erik and his warriors set their sights on a greater prize, the legendary city of York, a place where true glory awaited. The cold wind carried the scent of the sea as Erik and his warriors sailed south along the English coast. Their last battle had shown them the strength of their enemy, but it had also revealed something more: a land divided. The English kingdoms were fractured, their rulers often at odds with one another. If the Northmen struck with precision, they could carve out a new home in this rich and fertile land. Their target was York, one of England's greatest cities, a place of stone walls, bustling markets, and a throne that held power over the north. If they could take York, they would not only claim its wealth, but also establish themselves as rulers, not just raiders. Under the cover of mist, the Viking fleet moved inland along the rivers, their long ships gliding silently toward their prize. At dawn, the warriors landed near the city, their weapons gleaming in the pale light. Erik stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the towering walls of York. This would not be a simple raid. It would be a battle of strategy, patience, and unbreakable will. For days, the Vikings laid siege to the city, cutting off supply routes and weakening the defenders. The English, though fierce, were unprepared for such an organized assault. Then, on the 10th day, an opportunity arose. A gate left unguarded in the chaos of the battle. Erik and his men seized the moment, rushing into the city like a tidal wave of steel and fury. The streets of York became a battlefield. The defenders fought bravely, but the Northmen were relentless. With every strike of Erik's axe, their control over the city crumbled. By nightfall, the banners of the Vikings flew over York's great hall. The city had fallen. As Erik stood before the throne, he knew this was more than a victory. It was the dawn of a new era. No longer were they just warriors from the north. They were rulers, settlers, and legends in the making. But their great challenges were still to come. York belonged to the Northmen. The great city, once a jewel of the English kingdoms, now stood under Viking rule. Erik sat in the great hall, his warriors feasting and drinking, celebrating their hard-fought victory. But as the fire crackled and laughter filled the air, he knew their conquest was far from over. Ruling was a different kind of battle. It was no longer about swords and shields. It was about leadership, alliances, and wisdom. Erik and his men had not come to destroy, they had come to stay. They repaired the city's walls, reopened the markets, and allowed the people of York to continue their way of life, but under Viking law. Some resisted, but many saw the strength of the Northmen and accepted their rule. Yet, beyond the walls of York, storms were gathering. The English kings, though divided before, now saw a common enemy. Armies were being raised, and soon Erik knew they would march against him. The Vikings had taken the city, but could they hold it? Winter came, and with it the first signs of war. Messengers brought news of an army forming in the south, led by a powerful English ruler determined to reclaim York. Erik gathered his warriors, now joined by Norse settlers and even some English, who had sworn loyalty to him. The battle that would decide the fate of the north was approaching. When the enemy arrived, the ground shook beneath their march. Thousands of soldiers lined the horizon, their banners waving in the cold wind. Erik stood atop the city walls, gripping the hilt of his sword. This was not just another raid, this was the fight for their future. The battle raged for an entire day. The Northmen, though outnumbered, fought with the strength of those who had crossed entire seas for a new home. As the sun set, the field was covered in the marks of war, but the Vikings still held York. The English, realizing the cost of further battle, withdrew. Victory was theirs, but Erik knew the struggles would never end. The Northmen had planted their roots in this foreign land, and from their rule in York, a great Viking kingdom would rise. Years passed, and the legacy of Erik the Bold grew. Stories of his conquests spread across the north, inspiring more warriors to set sail in search of glory. His name was etched into history, not just as a warrior, but as a king. And so the Vikings remained, shaping the lands they once sought to conquer. Their tales would be told for generations, carried by the winds across the seas they had once ruled. The age of the Northmen had begun. The Vikings came as warriors, but they became something far greater. Explorers, rulers, and legends. Their conquests reshaped history, leaving behind cities, kingdoms, and stories that still echo through time. But their age of expansion was not just about battles and glory. It was about survival, ambition, and the will to carve out a future in distant lands. From the shores of England to the rivers of Europe and beyond, the mark of the Northmen would never fade. Though their time as conquerors came to an end, their legacy lives on in the lands they settled, the cultures they influenced, and the tales still told today. The spirit of the Vikings endures, carried by the winds of history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Viking Age. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more epic tales from the past. Until next time, farewell, and may your own adventures be legendary.